Okay, the purpose of this second presentation, or part two of this introduction to phonetics and phonology, is to talk about a couple of the issues within phonology that kind of get to how phonology can be helpful in understanding language. So we're going to talk about minimal pairs and some phonological processes. As we go through this, I'm going to assume that you are relatively familiar with the IPA characters and that you're reasonably comfortable with them. I don't expect you to have mastered them, but I'll be using those in this presentation. So you'll certainly want to have the IPA chart in front of you. And if anything in here seems to give you problems, then go back and take a look at the exercises or ask me if you have questions about things that aren't making sense. So when we talk about phonology, or at least when we talked about it in the last lecture, I said that phonology studies the sounds which make a difference. And I want to say a little bit more to clarify that now, because all sound differences make a difference, but in what sense is that difference important? So for instance, if you've taken a Spanish class or you walk into a Spanish class and you see the word para, P-A-R-A, which one of its meanings is for, and you're an English speaker and you're probably going to pronounce that word para with an aspirated P, that's what that small h indicates, and a very English sounding R, para, right? And that's an acceptable pronunciation, but it's going to sound like you're an English speaker. You'll have an English accent. If you hear a native Spanish speaker saying the word, you'll hear them say something closer to para with an unaspirated P. Notice the aspiration's not there, and also the R is really an alveolar flap, the same thing that we saw in English in words like better and little. Right? Now, the important thing to notice is that the differences between these two pronunciations, para and para, is not a difference in meaning. Both pronunciations mean the same thing. One just makes you sound like you have an accent. So when we talk about phonology studying which sounds make a difference, we really mean the differences in meaning. And that brings us to one of the terms that will become really important, and that is phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in a language that can make a difference in the meaning of a word. So, for instance, an English unaspirated P and an English aspirated P don't make a difference in meaning. So in English, the unaspirated P and the aspirated P, and I'm really exaggerating the aspiration there, but those don't make a difference in meaning. They are not different phonemes. In some languages, they are different phonemes, and I'm making up a word, but you could say pat and pat, and those would be different words with different meanings. Another example of different sounds that may or may not make a phonemic difference is from the movie Lost in Translation, if you've seen that. And if you haven't, you should. It's pretty funny. But there's a scene in which there's a woman who's asking Bill Murray to lip her stockings. And has no idea what she's talking about. He's being confused. The confusion arises because in Japanese, the and the sounds don't make a difference in meaning. And so a word might be pronounced with an or an and that won't change the meaning of the word. Whereas, of course, in English, it does. I'll give you a third example of the sorts of sounds that might or might not make a difference. Spanish has no Z sound, and I know you're going to immediately object if you've taken even the first day of a Spanish class. The Spanish language does have an alphabet. The Spanish alphabet does have a letter Z in it. But what I mean is that in Spanish, the s and the z sound, the voiceless and the voiced alveolar fricatives, don't make a meaningful difference. Spanish has no z, no voiced alveolar fricative as a phoneme. Just real quick, a couple side notes. You'll see me indicate sounds sometimes in square brackets and sometimes in angle brackets. And the square brackets indicate the actual sounds, the phonetic articulation of a sound. The angle brackets indicate phonemes. That is kind of the idea of the sound in our head. You don't need to be able to use the angle brackets and the square brackets consistently, but I do want you to know what I'm doing so that when you see it, you understand what's going on. Second note, as I indicated, the Spanish alphabet does have a letter Z, but there's no Z phoneme. In fact, the letter in the alphabet is pronounced as zeta, or if you're from Spain, as theta. So there's no zeta. If you say that again, you'll sound like you have an English accent. What this means is that a Spanish word like mismo will be pronounced by some speakers in some circumstances as mismo with the voiceless fricative, and by other speakers in other circumstances as mismo with a voiced fricative. Same word, no difference in meaning. Yes, there's a difference in sound, but the difference is not a phonemic difference. So with that in mind, how do you tell which sounds make a phonemic difference? How do you know which sounds are different phonemes? We've seen a bunch of pairs that don't make a difference. In English, aspiration after a voiceless stop. In Japanese, the sounds that are called liquids, the and the ul, don't make a phonemic difference. In Spanish, the voiced fricatives are not phonemically distinct from their voiceless counterparts. How do you tell what makes a difference? Well, to go back to the example from Japanese, in English we know that lip and rip do in fact mean different things. And so the words lip and rip are what's called a minimal pair. A minimal pair is a set of words or pair of words that are different only in one phoneme. And if you look at lip and rip, they have 3 phonemes each, and 2 of them are identical, and only one of them is different, the L and the R. So we call this a minimal pair. And minimal pairs are useful for identifying what words count, or what sounds count as phonemes within a language. I'll give you some other examples. A couple of these we saw in the previous lecture. Ether versus either. If you look at the transcriptions of those, there's only one phoneme difference. It's whether it's the voiceless fricative or the voiced fricative. Ether versus either. Now, of course, if you pronounce the word either, spelled E-I-T-H-E-R, as either, which is a perfectly legitimate pronunciation, it's no longer a minimal pair with ether. It's not a wrong pronunciation, but just for the sake of clarity, I wanted to comment on that. We also saw in the first lecture etch versus edge, and we know that those affricates are separate phonemes, and so in English the ch and the j appear to be separate phonemes because we have this minimal pair of etch and edge. Mat and nat. I included this because nat, of course, has the silent G in front, but it's not pronounced, so it's not a phoneme. You can look at these two words and see that they differ only in one phoneme, and that's the versus the n, the 2 nasals. And minimal pairs can also be made with vowels too. You can take a word like mat and put it next to meat and see that they're identical except for one phoneme. We can see then that a and e are different phonemes in English. Now that we've talked about minimal pairs, I want to go and talk about phonological processes, which is the other thing we're going to do with phonology that will be kind of important and will allow us to actually get into some of the analytical activities that I'm hoping we'll do during this unit. We talked in the last presentation about the word Clemson, and I mentioned that people sometimes will pronounce it as Clemson or Clemson. I want to look at why and how that happens now. If you look at those 2 middle consonants in the word, you'll see that the is a voiced bilabial nasal, and the s is a voiceless alveolar fricative. And it's probably a good idea to check me on that. Look at the chart, see what row, what column they're in, where they are in the square, and you'll see that those are how we describe them. And if you notice then, a voiced bilabial nasal and a voiceless alveolar fricative have nothing in common. Not one of those descriptors is the same. They're just about as different as 2 sounds could get. And that means that the transition from one to the other is going to be a little bit difficult. And English speakers will try to resolve that difficult transition in a couple different ways. One of those ways is what we'll call insertion, and I think the Labov chapter calls this epenthesis, but insertion or penthesis, whichever, I'll use the word insertion. And that is, just as it sounds, inserting another phoneme or another sound in between the 2 difficult ones. So you insert the p, the voiceless bilabial stop, in between the nasal and the fricative, and that makes it easier to pronounce. Now, why a p, you might be wondering? Well, notice that the p is voiceless just like the s, and it's a bilabial just like the m. And that means that the sound that you have in the middle of these 2 sounds now has something in common with the first one and something in common with the last one. And this sound acts as a bridge. The p acts as a bridge between the and the s because it has something in common with each one of them. And it makes the transition easier. And in fact, the fact that it's a stop means there's going to be a stopping of the air, gives your mouth a little bit more time even to regroup between the and the s it makes the pronunciation easier. So that's why we say often Clemson. Another solution to the problem of this pronunciation is to, instead of an S, to pronounce a Z there. And you see that the Z is a voiced alveolar fricative. It now has something in common with the M. They're both voiced sounds. And so you don't have to change as much going from the to the Z as you do from the to the S. Right? So when someone says Clemson, what they're doing is they're taking the voicing from the M and they're making the fricative have that quality of voicing also. Another way to put that is that they're making the fricative similar to the nasal, and because it's becoming similar, we call that assimilation. So assimilation is when you take the qualities of one phoneme and you make them more like another phoneme in the cluster there. Another way that people, or actually I'll give you two other ways that people sometimes resolve difficult pronunciations. And as an example, I'll use the past tense of the verb ask. Right? If you think about the phonemes there, it's asked, which is a tricky cluster of phonemes to pronounce, at least the consonants, the S and the K and the T. And I'm going to ask you to take my word for it now that the past tense morpheme is a T. It's a voiceless alveolar stop. It's not a D or an ED, as we've learned when we're writing. This is where the spoken language has to be paid attention to more than the written language. So this SKT cluster is difficult. If you look at what's happening, it's a voiceless alveolar fricative and a voiceless velar stop. That's not difficult, that transition. Sk. But then there's another stop, a voiceless alveolar stop. We go from the back of the mouth with the K back to the middle of the mouth with another stop. And that kt is a tricky combination, especially with the back and forth that it requires. So English speakers will try to resolve this difficulty in a couple different ways. One common way is deletion. Just like insertion puts a new sound into the cluster of consonants, deletion takes one out. And many English speakers will pronounce the past tense of ask as asked. If you don't believe me, listen to someone talking, and you'll probably hear that there's no K there at all. Asked. That's a way to make the pronunciation easier, because now you're moving from a voiceless alveolar fricative to a voiceless alveolar stop. Those sounds have a lot in common, and that transition is really easy. Another way that people will try to resolve that difficulty is through what's called metathesis. And metathesis is when you take the sounds that are in one order, and you change the order. Usually you'll just flip two sounds front to back. And so people will pronounce this as axed. Put the K out in front of the S. Perfectly legitimate way to resolve this difficulty. Now the stops, the K and the T, are right next to each other. It's easier to pronounce. I should say something about this particular word, because axed is one of the most stigmatized examples or stigmatized words within the African American vernacular. That's one of the things that people who really like to correct other people's language, they harp on this a lot. But in fact, we have evidence that this sort of metathesis has been going on in all sorts of varieties of English for 1,000 years. We have manuscripts in Old English and Middle English where the verb ask, it was originally askion, has been written as axion, meaning that people in England 1,000 years ago were doing this metathesis too. So if you ever hear someone say that ax is an uneducated pronunciation, or that it's a wrong pronunciation, well, it's at least as old as the ask pronunciation. So it's not something that's an innovation of African American English, and it's not certainly something that's necessarily wrong. Just a couple more examples of metathesis. This is my son Noah. He's 3, he just turned 3, and he is in the process of acquiring language and developing his pronunciation. And he's the king of metathesis right now. His consonant clusters, for some reason, he regularly metathesizes them. So when he says, "I want a spoon," he will pronounce it, "I want up soon." See what he's done there? The consonant cluster with the fricative and the stop, the SP, he's moved the P in front of the S. So that metathesis makes him say, "I want up soon," instead of "I want a spoon." You notice also, he's also deleted the stop in want. He says "wan," and that's something that English speakers do all over the place. If you've ever written the word "wanna" instead of "want to," then you've acknowledged the fact that we tend to have a deletion there to simplify that consonant cluster. Another example, he'll see a bird or the moon or a cloud or something, and he'll say, look at the sky, except he'll say, look at the sky. Again, you see the metathesis that the K, the stop, has moved out in front of the fricative, the S, and he'll say, look at the sky. Probably my favorite example is he'll say something like, I tell you a sweekit. And for a while, it took me a while to figure out what he's doing in saying sweekit, but I realized it's exactly the same metathesis plus one step. The cr, the cr the letters, the phonemes kr, he's metathesizing that, and he's moving the r out in front of the k. The problem is he's moved it all the way to be next to the S. And in English, we can't have SR at the beginning of a syllable. There's some foreign words in which we do that. For instance, the country Sri Lanka has that. But in native English words, we don't have SR at the beginning of a syllable. That's called a phonotactic constraint. We just can't have syllables that do that in English. And so instead of SR, he has taken the R and turned it into something that can come after an S in English and made it sweekit. So that's why he'll say, I tell you a sweekit. What I would invite you to do now is to go to the second set of exercises that are posted on Blackboard that will help you practice these phonological processes and identifying minimal pairs, and maybe doing some of the more interesting linguistic activities with this besides just working through the basics. So have fun with that.